Your hosts are Jared and Jason, and you have arrived at the after party. The crown winner of last week, and this is very, very unusual for a TAP financial gift, goes to the one and only, a magnificent gentleman in service to white well being. Slots, you know him well, folks. He's in the trenches every day advocating for white well being with love, hope, and redemption for our people, a focus entirely on us. Financially gifted last week after the show, $520. God bless you, Slots, and congratulations to you. That is certainly blows every other financial gift on tap out of the water. Well done. At least what I can remember off the top of my head. Well done. Well done. And in second place, another great champion who is with us all the time, advocating as well and financially gifting, Brad C. Great champion, financially gifting $20 last week. Thank you so much, good brother, and congratulations to you as well. Folks, as always, you know that you may financially gift on Entropy at a cost of 15% to you. And Entropy, as is usual, will be up and running shortly. You can watch the stream. You can ask and vote on questions and comments over there on the question widget. They don't disappear unless you or I delete them. You may also financially gift over on Cash App as well. The URLs for both are in the description below. And of course, Cash App is free to everyone who uses it. Jared and I, as you all know, evenly share the financial gifts with our guests on the after party. And those who decline the gifts, the gift ends up coming back to us for the activism that we do in service to white well-being. Now, today, we have the one and only Alex Thomson of UK Column with us on tap. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex, please introduce yourself to our esteemed community. Tell them where they can find you, and then Mr. George will take us into this scintillating conversation.
Very well. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, Jason. The URL that's on my lower third right now is the website where you'll find my content, ukcolumn.org. I've deliberately made that the only output, and it wasn't me that founded it. It was a retired lieutenant commander of the Royal Navy and a retired hedge fund analyst from the City of London that set it up when they became disenchanted with their former professions. But ukcolumn.org is, I would say, Britain's, I think we can say it of ourselves now, I think we are Britain's premier new media organisation. We sometimes call ourselves free or alternative media, but we're trying to get into the habit of saying that the mainstream is now the old media and we're the new media. And that's the main place where you can find us. I do have a YouTube channel, which has the name of my sub-brand, Eastern Approaches. I call it that because our Scottish correspondent started a trend before me, David Scott, by calling his sub-brand of UK column Northern Exposure, because he was very keen on exposing the deeds of darkness in that northern land. And so I thought, well, I live in the Netherlands these days, so that's east of Britain, so I'll call myself Eastern Approaches. Some people might recognise where I take that phrase from. It's from Fitzroy Maclean, who was one of Britain's intrepid spooks between the wars, trekking around the early Soviet Union. So it's kind of multi-layered for me, because I approach Britain from my new base. Well, it's 12 years now, but my new base in the Netherlands. So, and I've also spent a chunk of my life in the actual East, in the Caucasus, which I think we'll be getting to talk about soon. So that's why I call myself that. So as I say, the YouTube channel, Alex Thomson Eastern Approaches, exists. There's a few videos on there that have had good views, but I don't put up much content there because we're trying to channel our video output to being hosted on the UK Column website, both David and I. And I have, as of New Year, also a Telegram channel, again called Eastern Approaches Alex Thomson. Somehow I've managed to get 3,000 followers in 2 weeks there. And that is, without pushing it too much, the short URL for that is t.me/eastapp. And there, as I think the channel description says, I offer geopolitics, Christianity, education, and constitution. Those are my main contributions. I try to do a bit of each every day. Sundays is Christian content only. And my constitutional education project for the year is actually American. That's because it's the best in its class, but it's applicable to the whole English-speaking world. It's a book by W. Cleon Skousen that I'm reading bit by bit, not verbatim, but I'm getting the highlights out of it, called The Making of America, in which he actually did the hard work of discovering or bringing to light the 286 principles of good government that are in the US Constitution. And I'm talking about them briefly in an audio clip every day on that channel.
That is quite interesting. I'll actually begin with a specific question before we get into your story, just so it's not hanging there, is how much of that book actually traces back the American forms of governance to older forms and instincts that are that were present in the European peoples, of course, specifically British.
You're going to be interested in the answer there, Jared. From the introduction onwards, Skousen says, and for those interested in the background, the Skousen family, I think you guys might know, but the name might be familiar. They're basically dissident Mormons, right? So they would describe themselves as the conservative, patriotic third of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For those outside the US, maybe some even inside, they wouldn't realize that not all Mormons are on board with conservative patriotism these days. The Skousens say it's 1/3. Well, W. Cleon Skousen was an FBI man of the J. Edgar Hoover generation and a confidant of Hoover's. And he was most famous for the blockbuster expose of Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, which I think many of your audience know about. Carroll Quigley was Bill Clinton's history tutor at Georgetown, and in fact I met other students of Quigley's in one of my side hustles as an interpreter at diplomatic conferences, and they all think of him as some kind of god, Carroll Quigley. But he wrote this turgid tome.
Wasn't Bill Clinton someone who studied under him?
The fellow students under Quigley, whom I met in the interpreting booth, after gushing about Quigley, said, well, of course, I got a B in Quigley's class, and that's unheard of because everyone got a C. And Bill flunked with a D because he was spending the whole time there chasing French skirt. So that was Clinton, right? But anyway, Skousen, W. Cleon Skousen wrote, Skousen wrote a brief and digestible summary of it called The Naked Capitalist. And he also wrote a partner volume, The Naked Communist, because he was writing at the height of the Cold War. But anyway, to answer Jared's question more directly, W. Cleon Skousen then spent a decade or two, as you know, the classic American dissident style, actually trying to take things apart mechanistically and seeing how they fit together. And then when he finally wrote his book, he had the gumption, that's a good Scots word, I think it's understood in the States, the presence of mind, to say in his preface, these principles of liberty are Anglo-Saxon. However, he also said that they were embodied in ancient Israel. So he tries to trace the biblical and the ethnic roots. But he I think, makes a fairly incontrovertible case, which I've endorsed wholeheartedly, that there's few places in time and space where people have enjoyed limited government and liberty. But he traces the line forward from the Bible, certainly through Alfred's laws, onward through Magna Carta, in the way that many American constitutionalists do, and then ends up with what was debated around 1787 to form the US Constitution.
Any mention of the Norse thing?
There is a
meetings?
bit in the preface. It's something I studied in more detail at Cambridge because I did one of those unusual subjects, Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, which is actually a single course title at Cambridge. So it's fairly unique in that you study the Scandinavian, the Celtic, Germanic and Latin texts and peoples of the early British Isles and northwestern Europe. And in that, we went into some detail. And actually, within the British Isles, one of the jurisdictions that is a crown dependency, so not in the United Kingdom, but independent under the crown, is the Isle of Man. And they lay claim to having the world's oldest parliament alongside the Icelanders, because the Alþingi in Iceland has had times of interruption under Norwegian and Danish rule. But Tynwald in the Isle of Man, which, as I'm sure you know, also has Norse heritage on the island, has been uninterrupted. And so they have a claim to be the world's oldest parliamentary democracy and world's oldest codified legislature.
Well, it's good to hear some of that, because far too many Americans, in my opinion, feel it's a very one-dimensional narrative that we get, that we were this break because we broke from the King of England, that we were this
Oh
break
no.
from Europe, and really all of the civics and way of life that we enjoy is a direct continuation, of course, of all of these European modes of being, economically, politically, and otherwise. And it's high time more Americans realize that, given the circumstances, which we will be discussing today. Alex
Very
is
well.
here, and we are very excited to thread a few different intermingling subjects, the issues of the day. But as we like to do when it's someone's first time on the after party, we definitely want to give you plenty of time to tell your story, your whatever's appropriate you feel to share of your upbringing and your evolution, whether it was one watershed moment or maybe just a gradual turning up of the knob of your awareness of what's going on in the world and what led you to be a writer and an activist and the kinds of things we'll be discussing today. Chief among them, the protection of our people.
Yes. Well, what's dominant there is that I am the only child of intellectual Christian parents, and that is not such a big deal to a child when he knows nothing else, like any other child growing up. But in hindsight, now I'm just over 40, I realize that, well, I wouldn't say I'm more privileged than others. We all get the upbringing that Providence intended us to have, but it meant, in some senses, I think now, the way I put it is that it gave me a generation lag, in that I grew up thinking like, in the positive ways, like a post-war person. I was going to say boomer, but I would be disrespecting my parents because that's become a term of abuse now. But in the better sense, right? So I was listening to them and joining in their adult conversations fairly early, listening to them speaking to their parents about the pre-war situation, and that was good. But it also left me with certain false illusions. I assumed, especially because I grew up going to good schools, conservative Christian schools, and ultimately a fairly elite boarding school, Rugby School, which is one of the major boarding schools in England. I assumed that the set of values that I had were shared at least by the boys and the teachers I had, if not by the establishment more generally. And, this was the 1990s by the time I was in senior school, high school. And there were some scandals beginning to break surface, quite thick and fast, actually. But that was the worldview I had, was that there was no debating who when we're talking Britain, you get a few people now who say the English people or the Scots people, and I'm both. I've got one parent of each. More generally, certainly in the 90s, we talked about ourselves as the British people. It's become much more controversial to use that phrase in recent years. I understood that there was a place for well-behaved immigrants among us. I grew up in a pretty ethnically mixed part of the country, actually. People even in the States now have probably heard of the town of Luton for various reasons, if only because it has one of the London airports situated in it. Mm-hmm. It's about 35 miles north of London, and a few miles further north you're in Bedfordshire, and that's where I grew up. And Bedford, the county town, again, which is not far from where I grew up, is, I think, majority minority now. Both of them are. So, the difference was that there was a dominant culture, at least in the, as I say, the conservative and private schools I was at. I didn't and so we could, in our position of strength, in our generosity, shall we say, accept those who wished positively to be in our midst. I often found, actually, that some of the best British patriots and some of the best, I wouldn't have used the phrase common law back then, but some of the best exponents of common law and liberty under law I've consistently found have been what we call in Britain the West Indians, the Caribbean immigrants from Jamaica. And my mother found the same growing up in the north of England, even in the 1950s. They were absolute stalwarts. Yeah. But I didn't realize how different the experience was for other kinds of people of my generation who just happened to be born a few miles north or south of me in one of those bigger towns, until my parents started mentoring young men of my age when I got into my teens. And they were bringing home horror stories of what it was like to be a white student on some of these campuses. And I'm not even talking about, because my parents weren't mentoring girls particularly, so I didn't know about the sexual goings on, but simply talking to the young men that, that they had to be careful not to take any money to school, and look out not to be beaten up, something which Jason, of course, has written a whole book about, which I recently read. So he had the parallel experience in the DC area in the 90s. This was new to me. By the time I was getting into my later teens, it took a long time to chew over what that meant, But maybe you can throw in another question, because I think if we take this through chronologically, it could take 20 minutes or so. But do throw in some questions at this point, because
I would just jump in quickly to mention that you have some, we'll say, you can't really qualify unique, but just say unique experience in that you were raised with these Christian parents, and you were an only child, so you were privy to the conversations they were having with their parents. So these were conversations of a different time. You experienced, so there's the difference there. You experienced these non-white people who were, I guess, already there, and non-white immigrants who were new to the country. They had what we refer to as numerical diffidence. So they were generally very, I guess, they wanted to acclimate themselves.
Sure, it was one per class, right? Whether it was the local private school or whether I went on to boarding school, we had the Pakistani in the class or the Chinese boy in the class.
Precisely. So that's an important point. And yet at the same time, you then ended up, and this is a very interesting, I'm finding your story of your upbringing here very interesting so far, because then you were also then privy, by way of this tutoring that your parents were doing, to the white children who were experiencing something very different. And so I imagine the juxtaposition had quite an effect on you and how you understood the world.
Yes, yeah. I think your audience know, but I'll state it anyway. For Brits, and God willing, this will be the last generation that this is true, but it was true of my generation. The BBC and the National Health Service are gods, right? So if the BBC and the NHS tell you that something is good, who are you to doubt it? And I suppose you could complete that triad by talking about the spiritual element, which until very recently was the Church of England, at least specifically in England. Scotland has its own established church, but it's quite similar in attitude. And with that religious part of the triad, you could extend that into the educational establishment, the state schools, which about 85%, the last I knew, of British children go to government-run schools. Homeschooling is very moderate in number, although it's legal in Britain. So that's growing now. So with that triad, they were all telling us multiculturalism is great, multiculturalism is good. And it wasn't even at the stage by the early 90s, or let's say even my preteen years, the 80s, absolutely not. But not even in the 90s. It's not the case that, for example, Christian leaders were already saying it's sinful and evil to oppose multiculturalism as a way of life, right? That we hadn't got to that point. But precisely because it was so jarring in such a context for us to look from our Middle England leafy district over to what was happening in the little Londons, the sizable towns in the southeast of England, and realize gangs were forming and worse. Because of that, we still had the complete freedom of speech and thought. For my parents, more particularly, I think my mother, who's more outspoken in this way, to say, we didn't vote for this. Why? You don't have to tell me what multiculturalism is good or the new paradigm. I'll treat people decently. We treat people according to their lawfulness, and this is true in the church and in the world. That was something that they had a backbone enough to say, right? And only slowly did it dawn upon me in the 1990s that a new way of life was dawning. Now there was another sidebar or another delay, I suppose, here, because off I go to elite boarding school, and there it just goes with the territory that you are rubbing shoulders with white boys. You don't think of them as white, obviously, or British. You think of them as a particular kind of native son of the soil whose family made good, often these days through crime, white collar crime often. And so I'm in the dormitory with, boys who boast that their grandfathers are like international white collar criminals and all this kind of stuff. And there's always place for a small smattering in that environment of a few grandsons of African crooks or a few grandsons of Hong Kong, salty tycoons. But you just accept that. And the culture of that school is we're all learning together how to be on the make as it were, how to game the system. The arrogance that comes out of that is quite palpable. The plebs are there to be milked, and this too is not an ethnically conscious environment. It's more that there was fantastically racialized joking going on between the boys, but everyone gave as good as they got. You know, they would all insult each other for their skin color, but that's just because this was a weird microcosm, a distorted microcosm of society, in which you learned to be verbally very skilled, to learn more history and more philosophy of politics than the average pleb is allowed to learn. But that is so that you could get ahead and, you know, appear to be superior in the old British establishment way. And so the town in which we were situated, Rugby, is a railway town very similar to where my mother grew up in England's biggest railway town, Crewe. And as I say, in those kinds of railway towns up till the 90s, it was overwhelmingly local people who'd come from the surrounding county in the 19th century, early 20th century, plus a smattering of, as I say, mainly Jamaicans, law-abiding Christian Jamaicans had come in to the railway towns. And so if you took a walk through Rugby, it wasn't a racial scene at all. It was different kinds of white English boys beating each other up for the wrong school uniform, or whatever it may be, right? Traditional way of life.
I have
ahead,
a question to tack on to this, if you don't mind. I know it might be a big ask because it's hard to tell exactly what was going on in times past when we weren't living. There's always going to be that, what you call public school in England, the kind of boys behaving badly thing, and letting their relative status in society get to their heads a little bit. But is there any way to get a read on, in the pre-war period, so even in the, you know, certainly in the Victorian era, but then in the opening decades of the 20th century as well, that the patrician class, that even though there was the antics, that there was still also a thread of duty, a thread of, we're being bequeathed these positions.
Yes.
You know, titles and lordships and things like that were, of course, more prominent before the fall of the British Empire and things kind of dissolving mid-20th century. The essence of my question is, by the time you were experiencing this in the 90s, was it already that there'd been a deracination process where you're getting only, I guess, the bad stuff of that public school system, but not the good stuff? Because again, my impressions are just through books and media, and it might be a rosy portrait, but I have something of I try to sometimes have a bit more of a optimistic view of what those classes were like when there was still that sense of, we're British and we have a project together as the British Empire.
Most certainly we do. And my colleague David Scott, our Scottish correspondent, is always talking about these issues because he's forced to, because he is a unionist and a conservative socially with a small c in a country that's suddenly got a government that decides you must be a socialist and a nationalist and ultimately almost a republican and anti-monarchist to belong in Scotland. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, sets that as a qualification now. She says anyone who joins us, who's on our soil and shares our values, or sometimes she says committed to Scotland, is with us. In other words, you can be a birth Scot, but not, you know, not be worthy of citizenship if you don't share the values. Anyway, that was a bit of a by the by. Yes, you're right, Jared, and not for the first time I'm struck by how thinking Americans who read and meditate on British history actually understand some of the historic balances in it better than many educated Brits do. It's just something about being an observer with the same language allows you to take a little step back and see things more globally often. Sometimes that's true of British commentators coming to the States as well. They see certain things and formulate them in words that wouldn't occur to Americans. So yes, what we call the Edwardian era, the pre-First World War era, very much was that. Basically, every generation in the 20th century saw one further class decay into nihilism. We're now aware, I think, incontrovertibly, that our aristocracy had gone by the Edwardian era. It's now acceptable to talk about the endless rounds of affairs and also the criminal dealings of the very high aristocracy in the Edwardian class, the scheming that brought about the First World War. Between the wars, the upper middle class went this way, and a lot of the sexual revolution and the reinvention of ourselves as citizens of the world, citizens of no place with a capital N, capital P, that really didn't. We are aware of it hitting the mainstream in the 1960s, but in manifestations such as the Bloomsbury set, and those who went to, as we call them, public schools, elite boarding schools, that was already there between the wars, certainly by about 1930. Right, all the scandalous stuff was there. Then after the war, it trickles down. And, I got a good sense of that again from the family, because I had two very different grandfathers who had both done very good wartime service, very different in the sense that one was Methodist raised and had become quite atheistic, my Northern English grandfather, who was in the Royal Air Force. And the other was, like most of the Central Scots at the time, the industrialised belt in Scotland, only one step away from communism. That was kind of de rigueur for his class, but he'd become a more of a thinker later in life about the shortcomings of that position. And he was on the HMS Duke of York during the war. In fact, he was on it when they sank the Scharnhorst off Norway. And what they both said, talking to my parents with me earwigging when I was a boy, was that we had a bad royal family, but we couldn't say it in public. Right? So this itself indicates that, bears out Jared's point, that there was a lot of noblesse oblige still in the system, because otherwise this wouldn't have shocked and disgusted the officers and men. The men from the working class, like my grandfathers, the officers from the middle class or even upper middle class. The aristocracy's degradation and turpitude shocked the servicemen during the war. They saw glimpses of it, such as unseemly behavior of Mountbatten and of the Queen Mother. And to some extent, even the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, who I think both of my grandfathers told me at times was known to the servicemen of that age as the horizontal princess for all her drinking and adultery. Yeah. Right. So this was something that was becoming known in my grandparents' generation. Then my parents' generation, with honourable exceptions like my parents, didn't really care to know because they were the boomers, so they had one long party. And then with the rise of other channels to talk about these things, we started seeing it more conspicuously. And we didn't have the internet at my time in Cambridge in the late 90s. Well, there was the beginnings of it being used. But I started to be aware of these things in the same dissident circles that talked about demography, for example, that also talked about things that became UK column major talking points or reporting issues, such as elite ritual abuse of children, satanic ritual abuse of children. All of these things were talked about by the same bubble of dissidents in Cambridge, and they were all equally unsayable things, including that we had no longer a respectable or Christian monarchy, and we no longer had an aristocracy or upper class in business that was ruling us for our benefit.
Right. I know it tempts getting into internet meme territory with oversimplifying things, but do you generally take that traditionalist standpoint then, that the fish rots from the head, and yes, that not to take agency away from the other classes? But I know you've discussed COVID as well, and this balance of, well, I do believe as European peoples, we have more of an individualistic streak, more free thinking than other peoples. Yet at the same time, the masses are still the masses. Most people don't question the universe before breakfast, and the world works because of that. We can't have everybody tinkering and asking, but it's really a question of the what we would call, for shorthand, the elite class abdicating their position.
I think there's one of those books by Flann O'Brien, an Irish wit, written in about the 1960s, has these anarchic students dreaming of a world where everyone decides to stay in bed and it will all be rosy. And then one of them comes to his senses a bit and says it wouldn't work. The bakers would have to get up to bake everyone's bread. So yeah, that was just inspired by the point you made there. But yes, the fish does rot from the head. The saying attributed to many different people, I think, that politics is merely downstream of culture. So you don't change the world by going into politics ultimately, but culture itself is downstream of religion. But there are other sayings that are related to it, such as priests, so people, which indicate that, again, Well, that was the whole purpose of the royalty and aristocracy. And after the United States reasserted English liberty in the Revolutionary War, it specifically and deliberately wished to recreate that. The president was to have the bearing of a monarch without the being above the law aspect, which he isn't supposed to have in English law either, but he developed it. The Senate is supposed to have the ability to act as an aristocratic judiciary, and a disinterested or non-partisan judiciary representing the timeless interests of the land. So it was known that these elements in society are needed. And there too, you've seen the rot going from the top down. We can't let ourselves completely off the hook, though, because another well-known wisdom which has been borne out time and again is that you get the government you deserve. Mm-hmm. More particularly if, as the English-speaking peoples have said time and again, or insisted upon time and again, if you get to elect your representatives in many ways, from direct suffrage through to acclaiming the monarch, as your way of saying she's allowed to be our monarch, even, a lawful claim isn't enough. We need to actually endorse that. So by doing that, you've actually accepted responsibility, which, as again, you see in both ancient Israel and in the Anglo-Saxon heritage, you see the sages standing up time and again and saying, you do realize that you will be on the hook if you stop playing your part. Ancient Athens has the same in its democratic decay before the time of Plato. The sages say, you realize you're going to have continually to sit in legal assemblies and juries. And of course, at such high points, the people always say, yes, of course we will do that. We enjoy living in our free country, but sooner rather than later, they find it a bind and a chore to attend these things, and they find it much easier to appoint experts for them.
Well, yeah, and we have the issue of being continental in size over here. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that sometimes it takes the outside observer to glean certain insights. So we'd like to ask the pleasure of you turning your eye on the States for a moment then, and telling us what is so critical of the British upper classes, but a lot of people will say that a lot of the rot, so-called rot, really emanates from the United States, and that it blew back over your way across the Atlantic. Of course, it's a web. It's not like there's just one.
Yes, it is.
One point. But what are your observations then about the United States and its role? Clearly it was the dominant force of the 20th century, certainly the latter half, and continues, culturally exporting narratives and morality. What has been the ramifications of that, of this American world?
Again, I was mistaken to assume this, but I know, but I did assume growing up that everyone thought about the United States, everyone of sense and decency in Britain thought about the United States in his terms, that he would speak about the Americans and the British as we together. He would join them together as actors in the world. He only made one trip to the States. They're still active and healthy in retirement, but they probably won't be traveling much now. But Dad did go for one extended trip, mainly to Kentucky, actually, to accompany his pastor as an understudy in 1977. And he got to DC there, where he met a retired, I believe, one-star general who was sharing some of the, you could call it American samizdat that was starting to circulate back then. I think you can imagine what I'm talking about. And had a good evening with him in that sort of good old Southern way of hospitality. And he gently upbraided Dad, actually, as a representative of Britain, and said, you guys should have marched in and taken the oil fields after the Second World War. You shouldn't have given it to these client states, which, as he correctly predicted, would become, the Gulf states would become despotisms and would end up being the tail that wagged the dog, because Britain does do what the likes of Qatar want in foreign policy in many ways now. They've bought our loyalty. So why did he foresee all this retired general in wherever it would have been, Fairfax County? Well, he foresaw it because he regarded both of the. It was shameless to talk about it in these terms back then. He regarded both the empire and the US as two halves of the Anglo-Saxon people, right? And we had a duty to each other to do certain things together. Okay, Suez was the first major crack that was opened up in that from the British point of view. There was a lot of the same crowd that caused the Suez disaster went on to promote British integration into European military union. So that's something we know in hindsight. But Suez looks like the first time that the US was saying, well, we're going our own way now, and if necessary, we'll squash you. But if you read the Cambridge historian Adam Tooze, Tooze, The Deluge, you will find he's writing the same about the 1918 timeframe that Woodrow Wilson calls the British ambassador in and says, we're no longer your cousins. Quite bluntly, blood ties, schmud ties. From now on, we're an economic empire of our own. So, of course, we know how compromised Wilson was by globalists. Yeah, it's a pretty hard one to say at what point did America as a project turn bad. But I think what the central thing I'd like to say in the answer is when things were still good, and this lingered in pools like my family where we just assumed blithely that others were still on board with the traditional view, things were good because we understood there was an older mission, a mission given to a people with a definable history and experience. This is not exclusive of well-meaning immigrants in manageable numbers. Far from it, but it assumed that we could talk in the way that the French did in the time about, I'm sure you guys know, the French school history textbook back then talked about, on page 1 in one of the years of the school curriculum, the school book began with, Nos ancêtres les Gauls, our ancestors the Gauls. And this was something which was read just, perfectly well by the odd Algerian or Cambodian who would read it because he'd been absorbed into that people. Yeah. So, for short, and a lot of people are starting to say this in good articles now, America at some point, probably around JFK's era, maybe a little before Eisenhower's era, flipped from being a nation with a substantial amount of empire in it to an empire with a large nation within it. And empires, as we see with Russia's behavior in the world today, much as I understand a lot of the things they have to do to preserve themselves, Russia too has this sense of being an ethnos-blind empire. Growing up, I understand these days, because I have some fairly good contacts in the former Soviet Union, growing up these days as an ethnic Russian in some parts of Russia is quite a miserable experience. You'll get the same state-approved gangsterism and gangland behavior perpetrated on you. And in many areas, the authorities will say, well, don't rock the boat. We're not going to prosecute these guys because we have bought their leaders, much as Britain has. We've appointed them community leaders. And with them, we have the loyal vote of a large bloc of a certain ethnic or religious group. So in the name of harmony, as the Russians would call it, community relations is a horrible modern British phrase for it. We have actually ethnicized or politicized the ethnicities. And so the empire, therefore, by dint of being an empire, what you've done is stuffed your own people. Yeah, at least in the late stage of decay. And I think that discourse is something that maybe alert Brits and alert Russians are awake to, that perhaps not even many Americans might be awake to and use it and discuss in those terms, that America at some point at its zenith became an empire, and therefore its establishment decided that it was going to, if it had to, stuff its own people, particularly if they suffered quite severe criminality in some cases, in which the criminals certainly said they were visiting this upon white people for the sake of their being white people, or they deserved it because they were white or Christian. Yeah, that from that point of view, that's undeniable. And the response of the establishment when it has become an empire is, we don't care about that. No, we have an empire to run.
I appreciate where all this is going. We started with the biographical information, but now we're well into just this whole web of, as we wanted to discuss the different issues of the day. Is it your contention / UK Column's contention then, given what you just said, that ethnos is ideally the building block, the fundamental block of a political order? Political organization?
It is my contention, and I tried to major on the political philosophy within UK Column's work. Given my background, I was with the intelligence services, by the way. I haven't mentioned that bit, but that's 8 years after Cambridge. I was at the, for 8 years, slightly after Cambridge, I was with the intelligence services. Yeah.
Cambridge.
Not 8 years following Cambridge.
Cambridge has a certain reputation for...
yes, indeed. Although they didn't recruit me there. That was later on. But no, it's mine. To some extent, it is David Scott's. He's always asking, who are the British? He's very keen on that. I wouldn't presume to speak for the whole UK Column. We try to be broad because I don't know what you'd call us. You could split the difference and say that as a group, it has hallmarks of civic patriotism or civic nationalism, but really it's a spectrum of guys who tolerate each other, from me and David Scott, somewhere around there, through to Mike Robinson. And although he's actually with 21st Century Wire, there is an American contributor who's on UK Column every Friday, Patrick Henningsen, and his ties are much more with the old left, the decent patriotic left, and he's also much more clued into the flops and foibles and follies of what you could call the alt-right in the past decade. So he has a healthy dose of skepticism on this. So UK Column doesn't have a position on whether we should be an ethnos. What UK Column as a reporting platform majors on more is, well, yes, there is very much an element of, do you know who you used to be people? But it's not so much people as in, oh, ethnos, but it's people as in, well, you could in a certain sense say people of the book, people of the common law. Do you know what our heritage is? You know, we come out of the early 2000s scene, which, and again, this is English speaking worldwide, I think. There were a number of false starts. They got derided in the end under the names of freemen on the land or sovereign citizens. In parts of the British Isles, they became pretty popular. There was a time when it seemed half of Glasgow was on board with one form of that movement. This is one of the things with which UK Column is associated by those with slightly longer memories who remember when we were largely a print newspaper, and then the early days of YouTube, where Brian Gerrish, our founder, was up in Birkenhead near Liverpool, standing up for people's rights in court against judges. So in those days, we tended to be written off as nutty freemen, which we never were. But we were talking about our heritage as a people. Some of our contributors over the years have very much majored on that. If you go onto ukcolumn.org and use the magnifying glass to search for terms like Magna Carta or people or heritage, you will find a lot. And Mike Robinson, our technical guru, as well as presenter, has now digitized a lot of our back issues so that you can see what was being written 2010, 2011 kind of time frame for UK Column when it was largely in print. And there's a lot of emphasis there on rediscovering who we are as a people. I wouldn't then bridge that and call us ethno-nationalists. There's a substantial degree of overlap between the audiences, and there's certainly a shared concern for some of the main themes. And if you're talking that time frame, a decade ago, I think the big one that we were both both camps were concerned about, the constitutionalists and the ethno-nationalists. The big concern we shared was, how is it that thousands upon thousands of our young women are being raped? And nobody seems to care. And when you ask about it, you get squashed. Well, the ethno-nationalists went off in one understandable direction and majored on the hatred they could see among the perpetrators, the racialization and religiousification of the motives of those guys. UK Column went off in another direction, which is, who tolerated this? Who at social services and the other people at City Hall allowed it to happen in all these English cities? What are their political links? How many of them are known or strongly suspected satanic ritual abusers of white-on-white child abuse in many cases? And these paths are converging to some extent. But through the 2010s, there was a lot of mutual suspicion among the camps, I think, that were looking into these issues.
Which I want to speak about that more in a moment, what you just brought up. But just for your own, speaking for yourself, not for UK Column, what is your position then on, is ethnos the fundamental building block of a polity?
Yes, it's the only one that has stood the test of time anywhere in the world, in any age.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going on that.
And it was the understanding of the Founding Fathers. At the same time as they hoped to lure European immigration, the Founding Fathers spoke unashamedly about their Anglo-Scottish heritage, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
Politically, religiously, and in every other way.
Which we don't hear much about these days here. But yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned, so some of the same issues you were just mentioning are what woke me up. And they also, I think, speaks to the fact that this isn't just a geographical thing, at least not for some of us. Not every American feels this way, but I viscerally felt a reaction when I heard about the the grooming gangs in the UK or similar things going on in Germany and Sweden, which did a couple of things at once. It was just the bare force of waking me up to some of the things going on, but then it was also the idea that while, of course, I think like most of us, I have a certain degree of compassion for anyone, and I would cringe at hearing anyone in the world being on the receiving end of such brutality. It just frankly speaking, it struck home more. And why is that? It's because there is that sense of a peoplehood. I just couldn't deny that, even if it's across an ocean. Not every American feels that way. They might feel that they're the friends that they have in their high school from all different backgrounds. They're the people they know. They're the people they play video games with, etc. And so these are my people. I don't really care about some random person in Sweden. Maybe we could talk more about that in a bit. I think there's different ways to slice and dice that kind of thing.
Yeah, but that is pretty much geographical in my, I think, fairly extensive experience of traveling in the States. I've been to about 30 states, I think. Mainly it was in my GCHQ years, as you can imagine, visiting various NSA sites and State Department and CIA, but also traveling as best I could through the hinterland. And it's largely the Northeast and California where people say, so what, Sweden, Malaysia, it's all the same. There's not very much else of the country, I think, where there's such attitudes are dominant, except maybe in these growing metropolises in other parts of the country like Nashville, Charlotte, Denver, where, even if people are originally from in-state, once they live in that metro area, they become a globalist to some extent, a person of no place.
Yeah, that's another thing to speak about, American phenomenon in particular. But what I want to make sure, something that doesn't get away from us, is, okay, on that note of, let's say, grooming gangs, and I heard you speaking and saying, there's different, anyone could kind of conjure up different facts and figures and say, well, there's been a lot of white on white heinous crimes, or there was a Muslim person who actually sounded the alarm that this was happening. So we can pick apart all of these different facts and figures again. But what I'm interested in is, especially because I know your Christian heritage is a large part of who you are and informs what you write about, whether it's intellectually, theologically, is whenever this comes up, Jason knows, I like to almost put it past the bad behavior thing. So it's not to make light of the fact that these girls are having their tongues nailed to tables and things I don't even want to repeat. But let's say that all of these, there are millions of immigrants from, I don't know, Nepal, and they were behaved perfectly well, but they're not English. And that, I want to get people, again, not that you always poo-poo or always shelve the behaving badly argument, but I don't think that it can only rest on that, because then it becomes this debate about facts and figures of, like you said, well, there are good Muslims and blah 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 blah. You get into the weeds with it. I'm more interested in the integrity of peoplehood as such. Full stop. It doesn't matter. They could be smarter. They could be more moral. They're not us. That is the crux of the issue for me. I'm particularly interested, if you seem to agree with that, how you develop that, especially to other Christians, because I know you were speaking about that there can be kind of
you're absolutely right there.
Speed bumps with other Christians with that.
Okay, well, for a start, I traveled with my parents. Admittedly, it was only Western Europe because I was a small boy and it was only in school vacation weeks and whatever. So, but that was enough for me to see that the Mezzogiorno or even Paris is rather different from Britain, even though it was, Christendom and within the EEC, as it then was, that we were being told was, all the same as Britain. Secondly, I learnt languages, which any classic education will tell you this. It allows you to travel not just in space, but also in time to learn the ancient languages that all the founding fathers were so good at, where they got all their constitutional wisdom from. thirdly, Bible study, and I actually have always majored on the socio-economic and ethnological parts of Bible study, not to despiritualize it in any way, but that's always been particular interest to me and my parents, I think. So this allowed me to see, okay, peoples are very different, and then to make that leap in some inchoate sense in my teens, before I would even able to enunciate it, that the Bible doesn't say you stop being members of a nation. Not even that famous passage in Galatians, which the advocates of women's ordination always jump up and down about, that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, male nor female. Well, the key word is in Christ, right? You go out the door and you're still a man or a woman or whatever ethnicity you are. So that was part of the answer. Then the big break came after Cambridge, when I haven't spoken about this much yet, when I went to the former Soviet Union, specifically the Caucasus, so the very ethnically diverse part at the bottom of Russia, the mountainous zone between Russia and Turkey, and saw how people live there, and that there is, nobody makes any pretense about it. It's you look out for your ethnic group first. And having had a year of that and seeing how they are always on their guard against certainly mobilized other rival ethnic groups, and always thinking, at least in the back of their mind, are these guys about to do the dirty on me? Certainly when they're cheek by jowl in these large cities where the Soviets put them all. Coming back from that, and then listening to what was being said in the evangelical churches, that was already a bit of a break for me. Also, I was of working age then, so I didn't go to a student-dominated evangelical church in Cambridge anymore, which I will not cast any aspersions on. I went to a particularly honest evangelical Baptist church in Cambridge, where, as you know, in many of these places, you would have heard, it's delightful that God calls people from all nationalities, and so on. But they were too learned and too intellectually honest. In fact, it's still the same pastor as it was in my day. They're too intellectually honest to say, well, this means we must mix it all up and all pretend to be the same. Yeah. But slowly it dawned on me that there was a wing of evangelicalism that was going, flat out for that line of thinking. And I'd already seen enough of the world and read the primary sources of the Bible and of the literature from the time and place of the Bible, the Umwelt, as the scholars call it, the ancient Near East, to realize that this was nonsense, and it was an ahistorical bubble of thinking to posit that we must all, actively wish that the church be made up at local level, but of as many different people and nationalities as possible. I know that this is expressly the kind of evangelicalism that you find now in cities like Boston, London to some extent now, that, it's better to be in a multi-ethnic church and so on. It's more Christian, it's God's picture or such like this. That has been hard for me to sort of headbanging against a wall time. If God puts you in such a place, deal with it and deal Christianly with it. If God's given you a people that's still intact, thank God for that, and form a church there. So that's about as basic as I can say it. Yeah. So in a nutshell, the way I dealt with it was to see the real world and then look back at the church and think, okay, here's a bit of the church that has biblical beliefs, as it were, biblical theology with its eyes open, and here's another part of the church that apparently has biblical theology but has cast over it a stultifying layer or a gauze of interpretation, which is there are no nations, basically. That they wouldn't put it that way, but that's the practicality. That's what they show by their actual their deeds, is that they don't, that part of the evangelical church doesn't really believe that there is such a thing as an ethnos. Mm-hmm. There's the world and there's the church. But right back in the New Testament itself, you get the apostles dealing with this. You've got they're known as the Hebrews and the Grecians, right? Two sets of widows, both of Jewish believers, actually. One is a set of widows who are Jewish Christians who speak Hebrew and go to Hebrew-speaking synagogues, and the other is widows of Greek-speaking, mainly diaspora Jews. And there's enough of a cultural difference between them in Acts chapter 8, isn't it? Just after Stephen's death, sorry, no, 6 and 7, because it's Stephen, Acts 6 and 7. There's enough of a problem there for the early church to say within the Jewish Christians of the first generation, okay, we have two cultures in this church. You're never going to agree on everything, but we're going to try and get you to rub along together somehow. And we're going to do that in the way that you would still very much see in a multi-ethnic society like the Caucasus, where to this day everyone is, in some sense or other, a monotheist, either a committed Jew or a committed Muslim or a committed Christian mostly. And how are we going to show fairness within the Christian sense? Visibly by things like doling out this, a fair amount of charity or food aid to each of you. So the more you live together with other ethnic groups, the more you have as Christians to acknowledge the reality of the existence of these groups and make a show more and more obviously of saying, okay, well, we give each group its due. Yeah. So that the modern philosophy in the church is ahistorical. Let's pretend that there's no differences between us. No, that's not the biblical position.
It seems to me, just from a brief sketch of it, that we return to some of the themes we've been speaking about today, that even in that very multi-ethnic area in a big city that you're saying, like Boston you brought up, you might have some feel-good preacher get up and say, look at our congregation, people from all over the world. This is true Christianity. Even though this is on the decline, I would still point out to such a person that the backdrop of it is and thus the backbone of it is you are living in American society.
Yeah.
And that means something. So the people there who are recent arrivals from non-Western countries, maybe to better degrees than others, go along to get along. But the laws, the civics, the symbols, the language, English, everything is, in this particular case, American.
Yeah.
And then a specific iteration, New England, Boston, whatever. But
yeah, absolutely. The most American part of America in many ways, New England, but it's relying.
It's so even though there's this multi-ethnic congregation, when everyone goes home at night and the fact that they can turn the lights on and the lights come on and there's a reliable power grid and the police show up when you call them. Again, we know that this is on the wane in certain parts of America, but theoretically what I'm saying is this rainbow coalition is still propped up by the fact that it's on this bedrock of what we call America, which is a specific iteration of European peoples, of Western peoples. That multi-ethnic congregation would look and feel extremely different if it was same multi-ethnic congregation, but in a little town in China. And the point is, you can't get away. I believe you can argue, whether it's through a Christian context or otherwise, that it's metaphysically incorrect to be squashing everything together, that the very nature of life on Earth is true diversity, just like there's a variety of plants, there's a variety of trees, and that the whole rub about human life is, yes, where it makes sense, where you've taken care of your own first, and there's reciprocity. Yes, are there times to be generous, and if the town next door is of a different ethnicity, but they had an avalanche, and you have the means to go help them rebuild their homes, do you not do that just because they're of a different ethnicity? I don't believe that. I can't say that I can't get up
of
here.
Of course not. When the British Empire was at its immoral height, if there was a disaster in one part of the empire, there would be a disaster relief that was organized by the people. The government didn't need to get involved. And the basis of it was that we were all British, even if it was white helping black, white helping Asian, that was the basis on which it was done. So no, the generosity is there,
But it goes when it boomerangs and then it hurts the host population, or you begin to acquiesce to this quote unquote morality that there's no essence to what you are. How is that love? If you're loving your neighbor so much that you're destroying yourself, to me, again, I'm not as theologically versed as you, but I was raised Christian and went to Christian school, and from what I know, if you take the whole of it as these different, like the legs of a tripod, there's a
Hmm.
stable structure there, and a lot of the modern world, what is happening is the narratives kick out a couple of the legs, and they only talk about that selfless love, that generosity, which is really in the
Mm,
service of this deracinating globalism, but the lackeys don't quite seem to understand that. They
yeah,
think that
yeah.
they're doing God's
Well, I
work.
mean, you see this on both sides of the Atlantic. The let's use extreme shorthand. It's a bit irritating, but let's do it that way. The liberals in the evangelical church do tend to be from the largest metropolitan areas where life is, materially best. They are in comfortable material positions. These are not congregations full of manual laborers. Let's put it that way. And I'll tell you something that struck me more forcefully when I started having to do more with Americans, not least because they were missionaries who were present in the former Soviet Union, some of the best ones I met. Interestingly, I found them some of the best cultural analysts, streets ahead of the mundane Germans and Brits who would come into these destinations. The newly arrived missionaries from Oklahoma and Kentucky could get to grips with the local culture much better. And I've since seen that that is the case in like South Sea Islands and in the poorest countries in Africa as well. It's the Hicks who managed to get to grips straight away with the culture and have got a much more real world sense. So it's the liberal churches that preach this message, and regardless of what their ethnic background is, the members of these churches take it as read, I think, that they will have a nice government job or corporate job. Yeah, you get out into you don't even have to go far south, right? Like Ohio, Vermont, or out west, you will find again churches that simply because of where they are 80, 90% white, like the communities from which they're drawn, where people do actually, because they're self-employed or work for small businesses, have much more economic understanding of the world. And it's these congregations from the heartland that send out the missionaries, not only better in quantity, but better in quality, I've consistently found. That's just one way of looking at it, but everything is smaller scale in Britain than it is in America in the Christian world. But on the other hand, Britain is a comparatively bright light certainly in Protestant terms in the European context. So there's actually a fair amount one could say about the divide in the British church this way compared with the continent, where these issues are not quite so well teased out in many ways. And it's not just the English-speaking world either, the way you have this, because you were talking earlier, Jared, about how some Americans, to our surprise, don't seem to have that visceral sense of this has been done to our people when it's been done to fellow Anglos. Well, the range of response is even more extreme in the Netherlands with regard to the Boers, the only colonial Dutchmen of any number that have survived, but quite well known in the world, the Afrikaners. I have discovered after more than a decade in the Dutch Bible Belt that there's quite a number of people here who go further to the level of ignorance than you would get anywhere in the English-speaking world. People who literally say, "What, are there white people in South Africa?" Yes, I say there are. And do you know what? They're Dutch. No, that's not possible. Otherwise, I'd have heard about them at school, they say. Right through to, I enjoy hating the Afrikaners because they're white. Yeah. So from white Dutch Christians. Yeah. So an even further spread at both ends than you would get in America or Britain.
And the assumption there is just that they don't belong in Africa. They did wrong, so they're getting what they deserve.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I took part in lobbying actually a couple of years ago with a bunch of young Dutchmen, both Christian and secular, who were concerned about the plaasmoorden, as they're called, the murders on the
Yes.
farms. And we went to lobby one of the better Christian members of parliament from the Christian Democratic Party. And I think he said straight off something like, I'm glad that you young men are actually interested, because most of the young people are not.
Hmm.
But yeah, the whole vibe we got from him was, look, my party has got Christian in its name, but please don't expect any sympathy from my voters, and particularly not from the funders of my party, for the fate of white Christian Dutchmen in South Africa. They're much more interested in the rainbow agenda in South Africa.
Well, we've done several shows on South Africa here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that rainbow agenda is not quite working out.
And even before the latest change of government, they now have a coalition with quite a few basically communists in it.
Yeah.
But before that, Mark Rutte, he's still prime minister, but before that, there was a domination of alleged liberals, the VVD party. There were quite a few when that party more or less could govern as a senior partner in the coalition out of a position of strength. Quite a few of the ministers and regular members of parliament for that party were saying in parliament, these Afrikaners shouldn't expect to come to the Netherlands. They're nothing to do with us.
Yeah, that kind of thinking is very foreign here, which I would.
It was very foreign to the Dutch until shockingly recently. It took one generation of wacky education to knock it out of their minds. And I think a useful point I can make is I'm in the Dutch Bible Belt, which is in every way, apart from size, worthy of the name. It's in every way as socially conservative as the South in the US. And yet, and this is the point that proves it, you've got people here who won't have a television in the house for religious reasons, right? And yet, some of their kids are going to schools where well-intentioned school teachers are telling them that you shouldn't have any special love for people just because they're Dutch, you know. Where did these young ladies get that? Well, teacher training college, ultimately, because these are the ones who haven't even been watching TV and movies, and yet they've absorbed it, and they give it to the kids.
Yeah. Well, that aside, I'd like to, if we have just a couple more minutes, I know that there's some different questions probably percolating, connecting what we've spoken about, and Jason's keeping an eye on the chat to see if we have any audience-generated questions. But I did want to get in one more thing, and it seems somewhat relevant from what we've been just saying, and it's a little more open-ended, just to tack on at the end, but again, still relevant to what we were just discussing. In living in the Netherlands, of course, for the last 12 years, and or your general travels, we're always interested to hear when people have lived in different Western nations or traveled extensively, what you see as unifying themes that makes us Westerners in general, and of course, the differences amongst different ethnicities as well. We well know the reputation Americans have in Europe for whitewashing, as it were, and neither Jason nor I, we do not promote that. Jason has this great turn of phrase where when we recapture our destiny, the Welsh will be more Welsh, the Hungarians will be more Hungarian, and so on. But we still understand this period we're going through in our history as something of a bottleneck. And thus, at the other end of this bottleneck, we may well see this may be a weeding out process for people who do have that sense that we discussed earlier of an us, even if it is across an ocean, and that perhaps if our peoples plural, yes, white peoples are to survive, there will be a doubling down of our own ethnicities, but of course, also a recognition of what the bigger us is, the umbrella us. That's why I'm interested in questions like I asked at the beginning about the author you were discussing, tracing back America's political tradition to a longer view of Europeans. I've been very informed by the work of Ricardo Duchesne, who's been a guest on this show, with that same thing. He's very good about tracing through the different political and religious iterations tried and true character traits that you can reliably pinpoint and discuss and categorize of European peoples in general, or how things would proliferate across Europe once there'd be a scientific discovery in Holland. Researchers, mathematicians in Paris, in Vienna, here, there would be discussing the same thing, or arts. How there just seems to be, even though we do not take lightly the various ethnicities and the meanings therein, there still seems to be a group mind, a group spirit. Jason's coined this term, the biospirit of a general Western people.
Yeah.
So your thoughts and observations on that theme?
Well, many, but to keep it brief, we talk in short about the West before things reached the pitch that they have in this generation. We were more or less obliged to talk about white, this and that, which was, a fairly self-explanatory term in the past, or rather, so obvious it didn't need mentioning. And again, this was not to exclude the manageable numbers of immigrants who came in, particularly those with ties to us from the empire. They too would start saying that they were British. There was no need for terms like white, whatever people's skin color and ethnicity was. They were just on board with the label of with the set of values of British, or whatever the other Western country was. So that's the background. The West in the past, or the white world, as you might call it, another older term is Christendom, right? Because there was no, after the Scandinavians and the Baltics were about the last in the 12th century, in some cases 13th century. But after that conversion, there was no white non-Christian nation except certain Balkan peoples conquered by the Ottomans a bit later on, who converted to save their skins. So these terms were synonymous. So to tease them out now that the Christianity is a minority interest is hard to do. But I think altruism is one of the defining characteristics of those nations that you may wish to call Western or white. And I don't make any bones about it. I have many good friends of various nationalities, as you can imagine, and have done since my earliest days, far more than people who would call me racist for saying such things. I've actually dealt with smart young men from these various parts of the world and had honest conversations with them, of the kind you tend to do in boarding school when you're a long way from your parents, with these young men. And the reason I got on well with them, and again when I was in the Caucasus, is because the starting position, not the ultimate position you end up in after a lot of beating about the bush, but the starting position we took was: you are of that nationality, I'm of this nationality. You have that heritage, that you have this, I have this heritage. We respect each other. Let's see what we have in common. Yeah. So with that attitude, I can easily look anyone in the face, and I don't think many non-white people would be angry at me for saying this, although some whites would be on behalf, vicariously. I can look them in the face and say, that the bulk of your people don't behave like this towards people who are visibly different, who are of a different culture. You know that they're not altruistic. I don't need to get worked up to say that. Just accept it calmly. They know it perfectly well. And I heard little else at boarding school in Cambridge than complaints from the intelligent members of these various nations who were studying alongside me. My people are not like this. They don't behave like the British. They're always trying to do each other over. So the altruism, and particularly this naive altruism as you go to the far north and west of Europe, the literally blue-eyed naivety of surely everyone wants the best for each other and let's all rub along together. That is, I think, a particular characteristic of the West. And it causes us to be exploited in our homelands by if we're unwary. It also causes us to be in demand, again, by the more honest traditional leaders, tribal leaders in certain countries. I remember, Sierra Leone is a country that supplied a lot of young ladies to one of the Christian boarding schools where my mother taught for some of her career. And so I took a keen interest through that connection. And I remember well that when they were having their hideous civil war and all the over diamonds and all the stuff that was being done to their children there by their own people, one of the Sierra Leonean chieftains said, "We call upon our colonial masters to come back and rule us fairly. We cannot do it." There have been many other such instances. That was one that made it to the BBC somehow. So I took note. Yeah, so that altruism is acknowledged by our own history and by our observers from other nations, from other parts of the world, as a defining, I think, a special characteristic of the West. Of course, we have our own wicked people in our own midst and those who exploit us. But, if you're defining group characteristics, you need to generalize, don't you? There's a tendency that's very strong in the Netherlands to say, no, you mustn't generalize. And where's your evidence for this statement? Which I've now realized with a bit more experience what they're saying there. They're saying, I am proud of having no deductive reasoning.
And that, of course, is just proving what you're saying, is that there's a social pressure to be so uber altruistic that you can't even admit these things out loud, to your own detriment.
That's probably the reason why the Dutch Bible Belt is plagued as badly by some of this stuff as like some Stockholm kindergarten would be. Yeah, because here it's the school mom is saying, now children, we must all be very, very nice to each other because everyone else is too. Yeah. I think Morgoth. I think you guys know him well, and one of the I think it was he that coined this phrase, the hatchling, the guy who at least pretends that he just came out of his egg, and every time he encounters a phenomenon, you have to explain it to him, as if he'd never come across it before.
Yes. Anywhere in Europe you feel is holding out a little better?
Yes. I don't think that Central Europe is the cure for all ills, particularly not the Hungarians, actually, because much as I deeply admire them, and I've spent substantial time in Hungary on visits and seen some of their best people, bear in mind that they are Finno-Ugric, they're not Indo-European, and these things matter, right? It doesn't make them better or worse people, it makes them different. And so their project is always, even at a subconscious level, going to be more eastward looking than the project of most of their surrounding nations, even compared with the Poles, with whom together they've been a kind of a tandem, a kind of a brotherhood of two kingdoms that have stood against the Turk, the Russian, and whoever else, the German. Even compared with that, the Poles are much more anchored in traditional European Christendom. The Hungarians, okay, they have massive respect for Christendom. They have a rare achievement in that they have Protestantism, Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy to some extent in balance, as do the Romanians, and they've never had sectarian tensions in those countries to an extent which is very commendable. But the Hungarians, all this lip service they pay to traditional Christian morality, look at the deals they do. They're actually perfectly happy to suck in Turkish money, do deals with Azerbaijan, for example, which is pretty hostile to the things we hold dear. So that they're not a reliable partner. Orban is in some ways playing a kind of a pan-Turkic policy, although the Hungarians are in no sense Turks. They are very distantly related to the Altaic peoples. Yeah. So that the way I put it often is I get people emailing me asking about strategic relocation, which is actually the specialist subject of Joel Skousen, who's the nephew of the book author I mentioned. Joel Skousen lives in Utah, right, and makes a special focus on strategic relocation. A few people associate me mentally with Joel, and so I get Brits mainly emailing me about strategic relocation, and I usually tell them to stay put. And the main reason is one that I took from Joel, which I'll apply to my answer here, because when Joel's dealing with, of course, with Americans, it's mainly they dream of Costa Rica or Chile or something like that, something in the Western Hemisphere often. And Joel says, well, look, if you're a gringo who's tolerated for your greenback at the best of times, what kind of gringo do you think you're going to be when the money dries up? Yeah. Do you think you're going to stay out of jail? Do you think you're going to avoid a lynching? Yeah. And okay, Hungary is not Costa Rica, okay, but you'll get Hungary or Switzerland, places that people dream of as, bastions of democracy and Christian morality within Europe. You try spending some time there. Well, for a start, you try learning Hungarian or Swiss German. I can just about manage it, but then I'm a particularly gifted linguist, I have to say. So you'll never manage. You won't know what they're saying about you, and it will not be complimentary. And a lot of the time it will be at least eyeing you up, if not literally discussing behind your back or in your presence because you can't understand them. When this guy's money is no good, what are we going to do to him? Do you think you're going to get your kids accepted at their schools socially? Do you think your kids are going to compete with their kids for jobs fairly? Not going to happen in Hungary. Might just about in Poland. Just about. You particularly if you're, adaptable in the sense of being strongly Catholic or having some Slavic blood. Sorry, go on, Jared.
I just have to ask, you mentioned Switzerland, and I've read just about, the cantons differ one to the next, I know, but
very much.
They're the referenda, the very direct democracy, and a very different way of working out technically multi-ethnic in the European sense, multi-ethnic and multicultural country. Any thoughts on Switzerland in general? Yes,
I do. Switzerland is Europe's America. From the 19th century, the Swiss constitutional writers, the political philosophers, have been describing Switzerland as a Willensnation, meaning a nation that chose to be. Right? It's not just a phenomenon of blood. Nations that are phenomena of blood don't choose to be, they are. Switzerland, because of pressure from the Habsburgs, got together Okay, they were very comparable culturally and religiously. This was pre-Reformation. There wasn't a religious divide. They were in the original part of Switzerland, they were all speakers of the same Alemannisch dialect of German, but they were already living in very jealously independent cantons. And they banded together and they said, guys, we're going to be a republic. That was pretty shocking for the time. Again, by the way, the Dutch did it with the act of abjuration, Plakkaat van Verlatingen in Dutch, with which they told Philip, you're no longer our king because you're not suitable. And that was a very conscious precursor, by the way, of the Declaration of Independence, the act of abjuration, signed a few hundred yards from my front door here in the Netherlands. So Switzerland and the Netherlands both said, but in very different ways, with very different outcomes, we choose to be a nation from now on. The Swiss said, right, we're going to do it on the basis of confederation. Schwyz, Oberwalden, and was it Glarus with the initial three, I think, got together and said, okay, we remain three mini nations, but we're going to come to each other's aid. None of us is going to lord it over the others. We can leave at any time. Something like the Confederate States or the Articles of Confederation, 1776, something like that. That leads to a system in which, as the best writers have said on Switzerland, everyone's a minority there somehow. Okay, you could say, well, in Switzerland, I'm a German speaker, therefore I belong to the 2/3 majority in the country. But okay, what canton do you live in, friend? Because either you're going to be anywhere in Switzerland, this is going to apply. You're either going to be a Catholic in a majority Protestant canton or vice versa, or you're going to be a German speaker in a majority French-speaking or Italian-speaking canton. And there's all kinds of, right down to village level. Everyone's a minority in some sense, which means that the way that the Swiss have found is, well, okay, it's not completely American. I said it was the America of Europe. In some ways it is, such as the preservation of the right to keep and bear arms and the balancing of rights with responsibilities among citizens, yes. But here's where it differs, and this is fatal if you don't realize this. The way that their system keeps working is they're actually a quite aggressively competitive people. They've just sublimated this into business now. They're always trying to eat each other's lunch in business. But before they learned how to do that, they preferred shooting each other. And they actually had many civil wars in the past, as did the US have a big one, of course, over this. You know, settling who was the big, whose rules applied. So the Swiss had a civil war as late as 1848, and then they decided what they're going to do is split into liberal cantons and conservative cantons. And that's why they've got the current crop of 26 cantons. So wherever you are, your neighbors, if they find that you're out of line, are going to bear down upon you hard. And, oi, don't hang your washing out, it's illegal. Which it is if it's the wrong day. Or do not flush your toilet, it's gone 10 o'clock at night, we'll call the police on you. This stuff happens in Switzerland, right? And I know there are faint echoes of this in certain homogeneous parts of the states, like you have these community covenants in parts of I think largely the south, isn't it, where if you hang your washing out, you'll get a knock on the door because supposedly everyone on your housing estate has agreed not to hang the washing out so that you don't look like trailer park trash. Yeah, that kind of thing happens. But that's a slightly different model. But the underlying idea is basically you are tolerated during the pleasure of the community. Yeah, it's not the healthiest model. It's decayed from what it ought to have been. The Dutch, I think, are more survivable because they chose to be a republic, which was equally breathtaking. They got rid of the world empire of the time, Spain. They suffered abominably during the first phase of the war, the hot war against Spain. Within about a dozen years, they'd basically kicked the Spaniards out of their most productive towns. The Patriots had won, but it took another, in total 80 years to sign the truce. There wasn't much hot fighting during that time. And after that, they went for the line of, okay, our identity is we are Protestant, we are Dutch, we'll tolerate you if you're of a neighboring ethnic group, we'll tolerate you if you're of a related Christian denomination, but you're not the boss here. That's the basis of the fabled Dutch tolerance. Yeah, and that seeps through into Dutch life. I can cope with it. Some people are driven mad by it. Dutch, particularly the sort of the conservative or Bible Belt life here, it's don't rock the boat. You know, so there are actually, when I come to think of it, when I say that, there are some strong parallels with the Swiss in how they do things as well. The other relative highlight countries in Europe, or better off countries that are doing better right now, have similar things. That with the Danes, it's Lutheranism. That was absolutely obligatory in the past, in Sweden too. But the Danes have preserved it in a sense of, we'll get on just fine with you as long as you don't do anything outrageous. You know, and they have, together with the Dutch, actually, the Danes have some of the best freedom of speech laws and practice as well, court rulings in Europe. Although that is changing with judicial education these days being so globalist. And ultimately, you draw the judiciary from the population, don't you? So you, again, as with politicians, as we said earlier, you get the judges you deserve. They've got to be furnished from the population you have in any given generation. Mm-hmm. So if that whole generation's misled, so will the judges be.
Well, precisely. Well, this has been an absolutely radiant conversation. How exciting. And I tell you what, we're going to give a great cut and thrust before we address these questions. And that is, we will pick up the next time we have Alex back, maybe next month, right at where he's entering the school with the children of criminals. So that's where we'll go back. Just wait on the edge of your seat, folks, because that's where we'll pick up when we have Alex back. But this has absolutely been magnificent. And we'll jump right
glad to hear it.
We'll jump right on over to Stan 1, financially gifting over here on Entropy, $10. Thank you so much, Stan. And he says, Alex, where do me and other supporters of PA go politically if the political route is perpetually blocked?
You go under the state. I believe in secession, and I don't think you need to do a 1776 to secede. I think that is going to happen around the Western world now. You start in your own parish or equivalent in your own jurisdiction. And anything that has an election to it, the US has more such places. By the sound of the question, it's someone in Britain, presumably England as well. We actually have less than the states, but more than you'd think. There are parish councils. Right? There are so many ways to start building a political constituency, which isn't politics with a big P. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if you find yourself frozen out of the party system, this is a big UK column issue: the evils of the whipped party. It's something that the founding fathers, and in fact the British patriots of the age as well, said was repugnant to liberty and foreign to the Anglo-Saxon way of life, to have parties, absolutely. So if you know that party politics at parliamentary level is a closed route to you there, then start local.
Yeah, and that's essentially we say the same thing often. You build community where you are. It sounds like it's secession with a small s. And that absolutely endorse. We have David here. Let's get your raucous emojis out for David, who financially gifted $50. Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate that. And David has a question, and there's a word here that I'm going to use puppy for, and maybe Alex will catch on. Maybe if he doesn't already know, Jared will jump into the private chat and tell him. Because we know that here we have the ear against the door. And so here we go with the question. Thank you so much, David, for the financial gift and the question. Does Alex believe the puppies, Jesuits are equally to blame for the degeneracy and degradation of the West? Or does one have more power overall than the other? So this would be the puppies or the Jesuits. And it's a question, of course, that is restricting you to one or the other, and you are free to go beyond those two, of course.
I had better go beyond the two, and I'll tell you why. In the last year, I have been excommunicated by a former viewer in an email because I didn't blame the puppies enough. And the person who wrote this email turned out to be a fervent Roman Catholic. Not so long after that, I got an email from a fervent puppy who said I wasn't blaming the Jesuits enough.
Yes.
And therefore I was Satan's spawn. Right?
Oh.
Something about these two particularly gets to people. Mm-hmm. I don't know. These are massive systems, and neither puppydom nor Roman Catholicism has had much internal unity historically. If you're very realistic, it hasn't had internal ethnic unity. Neither of those systems has. It certainly hasn't had internal philosophical unity. And to the extent that either of these blocks has become a unified block in thinking, it's been achieved by the religious leaders in those traditions acting like tyrants to their own people in the ghettos, as it were, of both systems, to a far greater extent than is usually accounted for now. Another example I'd give is Tibetan Buddhism, which is often adulated now in the West by people who think it's like really spiritual. If you look at the history of Tibetan Buddhism, in fact, it was the American traveler Richard Halliburton who found out a lot of this in the pre-war period. The way those monks ran that system was unspeakably brutal. It was just like getting a visit from a demon when those monks rolled in from their hilltop monasteries and demanded their stuff from you. So yeah, these in pre-modern times, these religious systems were not unified worldviews. Not even Islam was. It was a system that was perfectly happy with anything you did as long as you paid it lip service and gave it your worldly goods.
Yeah.
Right. So we're much happier at UK Column, not just in terms of comfort, but because we're philosophically more squared with it, talking about Satan or Satanism and evil and individual responsibility. That's probably not a satisfactory answer for $50, so I'll go a bit further and say...
I could tack something on, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I say this as an observer of these, because we felt the force of what you say about how everyone wants you to come down on their particular side of things and how they think. But I've seen this comment, and I know someone might put this back to you, is even if there's a wide variety of what that term puppies means, and there's different iterations, both ethnically and religiously, we could still talk about instinct the way we were talking about our Anglo instincts earlier. And someone might say, following that, can we really point to prominent individuals or organizations from that people who are doing things to help white peoples? It seems like there'd be a lack of that.
To say the least. But you could say the same about Jesuitry, couldn't you, or the wider Roman Catholic Church? There's a huge spectrum of people within it, including some who are, out and out pro-white. But as a system, it doesn't preach that, does it? It preaches, this is the gospel as it came to you from the Vatican, and go and convert people. Don't do any good for your own people. That will be hotly contested by legions of patriotic Catholics in various countries who say, I and even my priest do all the best I can for my people, but it's not what the system wants.
Well said. And I would tag on quickly, and we'll jump into the next question from the great tall Kevin. To David is go free. It's a practice. We every Sunday at 5 p.m. Eastern, we get together, we talk about it. There's an instruction manual. It's like working out or eating right. And what we do is when an individual identifies themselves with their words and behavior as anti-white, we acknowledge that they're anti-white, irrespective of their background. And as a consequence, we put them in our story. Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, we put them in our story. There's a guy
from my hometown of Bedford in England who you might actually have heard of, Mike Buchanan. He's in some ways related to your interests, but he founded the English-speaking world's first anti-feminist political party called Justice for Men and Boys. He's no longer party leader. When he was party leader, he instituted an award on behalf of the party called Lying Feminist of the Month. And that sounds, in its own class, a bit similar to what you are doing. And for a while, they would award this, not that many of women would collect it, obviously, but they awarded it to quite major celebrities on television. Because, of course, the whole message that these women were bringing out month after month was, you must hate yourself because you're a man.
Right. Well, that's hilarious. Maybe we'll have to pick that up. Fantastic. But for now, we're going to jump on over to Tall Kevin. Financially gifting, $5. Thank you so much, brother. And let's remember, folks, while we're here, we're going to mention again, the great Tall Kevin financially gifted by way of advertising $2,500 just last week for the work we're doing in service to white well-being. So we salute that great champion. And today he is asking Alex. He says, Alex, oi, bruv, do you have your television license? If not, the jolly old bobbies will take you to the Tower of London and you will forfeit millions of royal crowns to Her Her Majesty's Royal Treasury. Why is the UK so litigious when it comes to license and registration?
It's training the plebs to have good habits. I think the broadest view I can take of it now, I realise that Britain is exceptional in its common law system, is that Britain doesn't have a population register like almost every Napoleonic or civil law country. The English-speaking world has to find, the government in them have to find other ways to say, we know who you are, we're keeping tabs on you. Britain chose to do it through the gods of the BBC and the National Health Service, because both of these mean that de facto the entire population is on the list with their address and their vulnerable details, basically. But 1 million Brits, the last we knew, have told the BBC to go and do one. They have revoked, this is the legal term to use, they've revoked the implied common law rights of access, whereby an inspector can go down your garden path and tap on your door, because your property, of course, starts at the gate or entrance from the street, right? So you put a note up saying common law right of access is revoked. That means that unless someone is a friend with an appointment, they can't come on your property. They'll be committing trespass if they do. And the next stage, of course, is they will actually write to the BBC and I'd say, I don't need your license this year. The BBC, despite what it protests and despite farming these things out to bailiffs, basically, does not have a leg to stand on legally to come to your property or demand anything from you.
How about that? That's the first intelligent response that I've ever heard to how to handle the BBC. That is magnificent.
Well, I mean, Brian Gerrish is the granddaddy because he spent years just pointing out to the BBC from its own reporting what a wicked and maleficent organisation it is. They do not like it up them. You know, we've got quite a back catalogue. If you go to ukcolumn.org and search on the magnifying glass for BBC, you'll be in for a bit of a surprise, I think. No matter how jaded you are, because Brian has spent years saying to BBC reporters things like, would you like the details of the victims who are being groomed at this school? Well, I'll name it to you. The school's changed its name since, but it was called Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. And, this was the school where, as Jared alluded to, we actually got a good Muslim guy tipping us off to basically white on white sexual abuse. But this was permitted abuse, right, by a licensed ring. So the BBC came into this because their flagship documentary program, Panorama, was tipped off. And a young reporter called Nicola, I forget her family name right now, called Brian and said, give me details. And Brian said, no, it doesn't work like that. You're gatekeeping, aren't you? And ultimately she agreed that she'd been told to drop the story and she was fishing for the details to bury it. We don't leave that lying down. We actually say this team at named BBC programme on this date covered up child abuse. They don't like it.
No, I bet malefactors often don't like their crimes being revealed. Well, I will have to look into that. Magnificent. We'll jump right on, though, to Rory Herbert, as the sun is long down over in the Netherlands, and we don't want to keep Alex up all night. $5 from Rory. Thank you, brother. And he says, did Alex's family have a history of attending Cambridge University? My great-grandfather was at St. John's. My grandfather attended Gonville and Keys. Not sure if I pronounced that right.
You certainly did. Well done.
Oh, thank you. And my son studied classics at Trinity. I seem to have missed out on the intelligence gene, however. Well, I can say right now that Rory is just being humble. He's a very bright guy. He says a lot of intelligent things in our chat. But I will pass the question over to you. Do you have a history, a family history of attending Cambridge University?
Quite the opposite, and I'll tell you why. This is the British class system at its less than best. My mother was a bright girl at grammar school, which is the academic stream of secondary education, the kind that you passed an entrance exam at 11 years old to get into. And because she was working class from the north of England, when she told her school teacher at the relevant age, which would have been 16 or 17, that she wanted to go to Cambridge to read English, the teacher said, "Oh no, dear, a girl like you wouldn't be admitted. Go to another good university instead." So Mum went to St Andrews, which I think that Scots will be quick to protest is not any worse than Oxbridge. It's just a different system, but it's one of the ancient Scottish universities. Well, I'm pretty glad she did, because she met my father there. But no family background in Cambridge. There were a lot who do, but I fear that a lot of Cambridge colleges now have tutors in them that would take one look at somebody who said my father and grandfather were here and reject them in favour of somebody who fitted the bill socially. In other words,
Yeah.
somebody to meet diversity quotas.
Yeah.
Also, I've just put up the middle part of the transcript of an interview with my father on the wider subject of literacy, which you'll find easily enough on the front page of ukcolumn.org. And at the end of that, my father says, quote, "It tears my heart to say this, but don't go to my alma mater. Don't go to St. Andrews."
Wow.
This was specifically because St. Andrews became the first, not the last, I fear, British university to require that people sign a statement of accepting their personal guilt for historic injustices before they can matriculate.
Good God. It just gets worse by the day. It makes it easier to wake our brothers and sisters up to the evil of anti-whiteism. Mm-hmm. We have Henry Walker here. Just 2 more financial gifts. It's been so magnificent. $3 financial gift from Henry. Alex, I'm an Englishman looking to move to a different country. Which is the best Southern European country to move to? Which country in Eastern Europe is the best to move to? Thanks.
I like specific questions like that. I am fairly confident in saying that the best Southern European country to move to is Portugal. And I think that the Algarve in particular, okay, they have some problems with their legislation right now, such as an eminent domain act as of last year, which is pretty fierce, but people are organizing against it. Those people have it in their blood and in their recent past to be pro-liberty, and crucially, the local cops. It's not quite as divided as the federal, state, county cops that you get in the States, but the local cops, even if they wear the national police uniform in Portugal, they are men of their own people. So if they're told to arrest dissidents, they will find ways not to do so, right? Spain has gone a lot, in the age of COVIDianism, has gone a lot more towards that end of the spectrum, I think. But still, Southern Europe, and particularly the southern halves of those countries, the Italian Mezzogiorno too, are a bright hope. I would say Portugal is the best Southern European country. The best Eastern European country is, I'm supposed to be an expert on this, I'm going to cover all bases in one go. I would have to say Poland. Right, Belarus and Ukraine. I went into this in extra time for UK column members fairly recently, that those 3 neighboring countries, the historic heartland of the Eastern Slavs, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, all have the potential, certainly when they shed their current leadership, to be the motherlode of renascent European Christendom. But Poland's the first country to have gotten that far. They're a state of law and order. In fact, the governing part, the dominant party, calls itself the party of law and justice, which says something. They're not a perfect country, but they are acutely aware of their own shortcomings, and they're working on them. And you will be warmly accepted as an Englishman there. They do have Englishmen have a positive cachet there. So there you are. Portugal and Poland is my view.
A straightforward answer to a straightforward question. Thanks so much.
There are outliers that have extra benefits, but these jurisdictions can change almost overnight. Poland and Portugal have very low chances of going completely off script.
All the better of answers then, because that obviously is, you can have a place, just as you said, you can have a place that is magnificent at the moment. It's like the stock market. Something's looking great right now, and then a year from now, everything is down the drain.
The Poles and the Portuguese have a history of actually overturning their own rotten governments rather than going along with whatever the new paradigm is. Did Jared have a?
That's a good paradigm. I was just asking how they are with green passes. I know someone in Italy right now who is living there, quite concerned about the growing restrictions on him.
The
shops.
In theory, Portugal has this fully. And to some extent, it's enforced even in the south. I know from my contacts there, not religiously. Poland is almost in the zone where you can buy anything forged or just bribe somebody. And certainly if you go any further east, Ukraine, absolutely. Nobody gives 2 hoots. And even if, they have to look busy because the boss is around and make a big show of asking for your papers, please, you just slip them what would it be, a 500 hryvnia bill, or you flash a forged pass. Not a problem out there.
Right.
Lithuania's gone absolutely fascist in this regard.
Really?
There's been a well-known blogger called Gluboko, I think, on Twitter. If I'm not mistaken, it's GLUBOCO is his Twitter handle. And he's made an art form out of long Twitter threads, which other people have turned into contiguous web pages for him, describing with much photo reportage how you've got heavies on the door of every mom and pop store saying, "Papers, please."
Oh, I didn't know that about Lithuania. Wow.
Jeez.
Yeah. What the buggers like, if you're allowed to use that word, is small, docile jurisdictions, preferably English speaking or at least with good rule of law, which is why Scotland, the Australian state of Victoria, and some of the majority Scottish ethnic states in the US tends to get used as laboratories, because that's a law-abiding, docile population historically that's used to having limited and well-meaning government. And in Eastern European terms, what you want is a country like Lithuania for your experiments, because it has only a population of 1 million people, and they're very well educated and do as they're told.
Wow. Well, we have one more financial gift, and it is from the great Mrs. Jess Horse, a mother of 9, financially gifting $25, and they're all going free. Thank you so much. Big round of August emojis for Mrs. Jess Horse, $25 financial gift. And she writes here, interesting and informative. Thank you for being on, Alex, with 3 white heart emojis. And with that, Alex, I will ask you for your final thoughts. And one more time, if you could give folks the addresses where they can find you.
This has been a great pleasure, and I do look forward to repeat episodes of this. Thank you very much indeed. Perhaps in future we should also talk more about my impressions of the USA, because I think I have a fair amount to say about that. I would love to. So to repeat, it's ukcolumn.org, where I appear every Wednesday at least in the British time zone, it's lunchtime news. And for logged in members, we have an extra time segment on our live chat, and also available afterwards to members in the forums on the website. There is some content on YouTube with the channel name Alex Thomson Eastern Approaches. The most popular of my videos to date has been a spontaneous live in one take recording that I did from my desk of the RAINS list, which is a fairly exhaustive list of the multiple confirmed Satanist ritual abusers in the English elite on the South Coast in the 2000s, with some big names on it. And I am also now running a Telegram channel simply called Eastern Approaches Alex Thomson. That's t.me/eastapp.
Magnificent. Thank you, brother. Mr. George.
Well, I second what you said, Alex, in terms of looking forward to future conversations, and thank you for today. Just while it's fresh in our minds, I took a few notes about possible things to speak about next time. I'm going to rattle these off very quickly and then tell me if I missed anything. But going on various things we've spoken about today, I think some good seeds for next time would be more about the terms British versus English.
Very gladly. And I'd much rather talk about that with Americans than anyone else, because we can have a much more objective discussion than we could do with Brits, I think.
Oh, very good. Okay. About how people might hide behind that. The plummeting reputation of high-level degrees. You mentioned what's going on at Oxford, Cambridge, and St. Andrews. Maybe a little bit more about ethnos as a political organization. I like this little anecdote that Thomas Jefferson wanted Hengst and Horsa, the Anglo-Saxon kind of equivalent of Romulus and Remus, on the back of U.S. bills, and how that
this is in W. Cleon Skousen's The Making of America, actually, in the introductory material.
I'm fascinated by things like that, where that one little symbolic difference could have went a long way in having people understand ethnos more. Your time in Russia and the Caucasus, we didn't talk any about COVID tyranny. You just said your impressions of the U.S. I'd also like to get more of your specific Dutch versus English differences, because you've lived in both places. Anything I should add to this document, or do you think that'll be
well? That's it. I'm a keen musician, though I don't sing or play much anymore. Any questions people want to throw away with regard to Christian matters, very glad to take. But there are many other focuses that we could take in this discussion. We could talk about Eastern Europe more generally, how it's changed over the past 20 years and its various zones. I am also, I don't think I'll be doing it anymore, but I'm an interpreter on the list for the European diplomatic bodies, so the EU and the associated bodies that share the same list. So that's actually a fairly elite thing. I'm a freelancer with them.
Yeah.
So I can tell you something about those organizations. I was in British intelligence for 8 years. So talk about that at an unclassified level. I out of loyalty and decency, I don't, spill the beans. I don't have any sour grapes anyway about that time. But it did, like my previous times at Rugby in Cambridge, sow more seeds of realization in my mind about the difference between appearance and reality in the British establishment. So,
I bet so.
Yeah, these are themes we could talk about.
We might have enough for at least 2 episodes where freelancer for what body in the EU? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Oh, you go on a list for, it's shared between the organizations. So it's a list for the European Union's of the interpreters that they can call upon, because they can't cover the simultaneous interpreting they have just from their staff. So they have as many people again who are on the staff are on a freelance list, which means you pass the same exam, obviously.
Right.
And so before COVID, it would mean that you would just be called up and would you mind awfully going down to Strasbourg or Brussels for a week and doing a session of parliamentarians or bureaucrats, as we call them, having meetings.
I see. Well, yeah,
very prestigious.
It must be interesting to take that in and be present for some of that. Well, yes, let's make sure we do this again. I think I've enjoyed it. I know our chat has as well, and we'd love to have you on somewhat regularly. This has been wonderful.
It really has.
Well, folks, that's it. You can find old episodes on theafterparty.tv. My site is thegreatorder.com. I was trying some different things about approaching my next song and how it's getting done, so it's a little delayed. I don't know. If it keeps getting delayed, maybe I'll do one of those one-off acoustic performances. I'm a musician too, Alex. So
very good.
I've been releasing some produced tracks and some other side projects as well, trying to contribute to the cultural aspect of things. But other than that, we will see you all very soon. And thank you again for listening.
Yes, we're very proud of Jared. He's made some magnificent pieces, and we look forward to a lot more of those. I'm very proud of a lot of the folks who have been here today, speaking up, participating in the live chat. And of course, we want to give a big thank you to the magician on the mountain, Fornull, a great musician and tech wizard and everything else, who's been here moderating over the course of the stream. A big thank you to everyone who financially gifted, and hello to all you wallflowers out there. We've been having a few of those speak up a little bit more often, getting braver in these dark times. We appreciate that, but don't stress. If you want to remain a wallflower, please do. That's fine. Please pick up the practice of going free, improve yourself, improve your life, improve your family and those around you, and we'll be able to recapture our destiny. Folks, if you want to come back for some more brilliant erudition, make sure that you're with us the next time we name Alex Thomson as a guest on Tap, and we look forward to seeing you all again next time. Bye-bye.